The army bus that tore Jacob Barnes from Cleveland was a metal box reeking of disinfectant and fear, a rusted ferry crossing the River Styx towards the underworld of Fort Benning, Georgia. With every highway sign that passed, Jake's world shrank, the familiar landscapes of Ohio flattening into a nostalgic, irrelevant memory. He looked at the other faces on the bus, a collection of tense jaws and eyes trying, unsuccessfully, to look tough. They were kids from Iowa farms, from Chicago housing, projects from California suburbs, all of them having signed the same Faustian contract. The conversation was a mixture of bravado and dread. "I heard they break your leg on the first day, just to see if you're man enough," lied a skinny kid from Boston. Jake remained silent, feeling the hum of the engine vibrate in his bones. When the bus finally stopped and the door opened with a hiss that sounded like the last breath of his old life, what hit them was a total sensory assault. The Georgia air was a thick, humid soup that clung to his skin, smelling of pine trees, red clay, and mildew. And then came the screams. They weren't just screams. They were sonic shockwaves, the voice of a drill sergeant who seemed to have gargled with gravel and rage. "Welcome to hell, ladies. The life you thought you knew? It's over. You are now the property of the United States government." Jake stumbled out, the sunlight blinding him, and his feet found the yellow footprints painted on the hot asphalt. In that moment, he felt the tectonic plate of his life shift violently. The fight for his medical waiver seemed like child's play. The real war, he realized with terrifying clarity, was not against a foreign enemy, but against the annihilation of his own being. The first 48 hours were a blur of systematic humiliation, a process of dehumanization so efficient it was almost beautiful in its brutality. The goal was simple: to erase Jacob Barnes so that Recruit Barnes could be programmed. The first stop was the haircut. Jake sat in the chair while a barber with an impassive face ran the clippers over his scalp, the sound like a swarm of metallic bees. He watched, helpless, as his brown curls, the same ones his mother used to stroke, fell to the floor to mix with those of dozens of other boys. When he looked in the mirror, he saw a stranger with ears that seemed too big, his head now a vulnerable blank canvas. Next came the uniform issue, where he was thrown a series of olive drab clothes that didn't fit right and smelled of decades of storage. He was being dressed in someone else's skin, a skin that belonged to the army. The lines were endless, each one a test of patience and obedience. In one of them, he saw a boy begin to cry silently, the tears tracing clean paths on his dirty face. No one said anything. They just stared ahead, learning the first unwritten rule: another man's pain is not your problem. The process was a constant assault, designed to overwhelm and confuse. Paperwork, vaccinations, measurements. It was a factory whose assembly line disassembled human beings. At the end of the second day, lying on a hard bunk that wasn't his, in a room that wasn't his, surrounded by strangers, Jacob Barnes felt a loneliness so deep and vast it was almost physical, a black hole in his chest. He was no one from nowhere anymore. He was raw material, waiting to be molded. At the center of this new solar system of pain orbited the figure of Drill Sergeant Reyes. Reyes was not simply an instructor. He was a phenomenon, an artist of intimidation. He moved with the economy of a predator, every step deliberate, every gesture laden with an implicit threat. His voice was his masterpiece. He could whisper a correction that sounded more threatening than any scream, or he could unleash a roar that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, a sonic force that made Jake's bones vibrate. Reyes had an uncanny ability to identify a man's weakness and turn it into a public spectacle. He nicknamed a chubby kid Snowball, an intellectual with glasses Professor, and Jake, because of his football past, Porcelain Quarterback. "You think you can lead men, quarterback?" Reyes would snarl in Jake's face, his breath a mix of coffee and contempt enveloping him. "You can't even make your bed without whimpering for your mommy." But it wasn't just sadism. There was a cruel intelligence to his methodology. He never punished just the offense. He punished the mindset behind it. He wasn't just building soldiers. He was conducting a complex psychological surgery, excising the ego, the complacency, and the doubt. Jacob Barnes hated him with a passion that consumed him. Reyes became the voice in his dreams, the face of all his failures. Yet somewhere deep down, Jake knew he needed that hatred. Hating Reyes was easier than hating himself, and that hatred became the fuel that kept him on his feet, when all else failed. Jacob Barnes's body, once a source of pride and power on the football field, became a prison of pain. The physical training was a scorched earth campaign against his own self-perceived limits. The morning runs were a daily descent into hell. Jake ran in formation, the cold, humid Georgia air like razors in his lungs, the sound of 100 feet hitting the asphalt in a brutal cadence. His mind became a battlefield. One part screamed at him to stop, to fall, to give up. Another part, fueled by his anger at Reyes, forced him to take one more step. And a third, quieter part thought of his father, of his promise to fight. He ran through waves of pain, nausea, and exhaustion until he reached a strange, almost transcendental state where the body kept moving while the mind floated above, watching. The calisthenics sessions were equally brutal. The push-ups were endless. Jake pushed the earth away until his pectoral and tricep muscles were on fire, until sweat dripped from his nose and formed a puddle on the ground. "Does the ground feel good down there, Barnes?" Reyes would scream. "Maybe you should kiss it. Thank it for holding you up." Pain was the primary language of that place, and Jake was becoming fluent. He was learning the most fundamental lesson of the soldier. The body is not you. It is a tool, a machine of flesh and bone that can be pushed, punished, and forced to operate far beyond its factory specifications. He was being taught to separate himself from his own pain, to treat it as background noise, an inconvenience and not as a signal to stop. The philosophy of I was systematically dismantled and replaced with the theology of we. The primary tool for this forced conversion was collective punishment, a tactic as old as war itself. If one recruit, a boy named Miller who seemed to have been born with 2 left feet, forgot a piece of his gear, Reyes's fury didn't focus solely on Miller. It spread through the platoon like a wildfire. "So, Private Miller thinks he's at summer camp," Reyes would announce to everyone. "It looks like the whole platoon needs a reminder that this is a team," and so all of them would be on the training yard, in the mud, paying for Miller's sins. Jake's initial reaction was a caustic resentment. He cursed Miller in silence, his anger growing with every painful push-up. But the cruel genius of the system was that it made this anger self-destructive. After several of these episodes, the dynamic shifted. The survival of the group trumped individual resentment. The night before a major inspection, Jake found himself not just organizing his own locker, but Miller's as well, patiently teaching him how to fold his t-shirts into perfect 6-inch squares. It wasn't out of kindness. It was out of self-preservation. He realized it was easier to spend 10 minutes helping Miller than to spend 2 hours suffering because of him. It was a pragmatic epiphany. Jacob Barnes was learning that in this new universe, his fate was inextricably linked to that of the weakest man in his unit. It was a brutal lesson in responsibility and interdependence, forged in the fire of shared suffering. The barracks, the bay, was a closed ecosystem, a biodome of testosterone and despair. It was a long hall, painted in sickish shades of green and institutional grey, that smelled of an unmistakable mix of old sweat, pine-scented disinfectant, and boot polish. Privacy was a concept as alien as mercy. Jake lived his life in public. He dressed, slept, and wrote letters, home under the gaze of 50 other men. The nights were filled with a symphony of snores, coughs, and the occasional whispers of a man crying silently into his bunk. The mornings exploded into a chaos of frenetic activity, everyone rushing to shave, make their beds, and clean their area before the storm named Reyes broke upon them. But it was in this environment of forced exposure and vulnerability that something unexpected happened, the formation of a tribe. They gave each other nicknames. Jake remained quarterback, Diaz was mouth, Tex was, well, Tex. They developed a system for smuggling candy from the mess hall, a small act of rebellion that felt like a major victory. They would read each other's letters in hushed tones, sharing news from a world that felt increasingly distant. On one particularly hard night, after a day of incessant punishment, Jake lay on his bunk, feeling utterly broken. Diaz, from his bunk above, whispered, "Hey, quarterback, tomorrow's another day. We got this." Those simple words, whispered in the dark, were more effective than any general's speech. In that barracks, Jacob Barnes was discovering a new definition of family, one not bound by blood, but by shared suffering. The issuing of the M16 rifle to Jacob Barnes was an event that transcended the military. It was almost mystical. They were marched to the armory, and the weapons were distributed with a solemnity bordering on religious reverence. When the cold, heavy rifle was placed in his hands, Jake felt a fundamental shift in his being. He was no longer just a recruit, he was a weapon bearer. Sergeant Reyes had them stand in formation for an hour, just holding the rifles. "Feel the weight of it," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "That weight is responsibility. It is the power to protect the man beside you, and the power to destroy your enemy. Never treat it lightly." The rifle, which he internally named Mary after his mother in an act of dark irony, became the center of his existence. The ritual of cleaning it became his daily meditation. He learned to love it, to hate it, to understand it. He learned the distinct sound each part made as it clicked into place, the smell of the cleaning oil, the feel of the cold metal against his cheek as he took aim. The rifle was the only thing in that world that was completely logical and reliable. It didn't lie. It didn't feel emotions. It only responded to his skill and care. In an environment designed to break his will, mastery of his rifle became Jake's only source of agency. It was the one thing he could completely control. Carrying that weapon was a constant, heavy reminder of his purpose there. Jacob Barnes, the boy who dreamed of throwing footballs, was now learning to launch 5.56 minutes projectiles at a speed of 990 meters per second. There were rituals in basic training that existed outside the realm of tactical logic. They were trials, tribal rites of passage designed to break the spirit and forge it anew in the fire of a shared, terrible experience. None was more infamous than the visit to the tear gas chamber. The anticipation was a torture in itself. Veterans from other companies told them horror stories, describing the sensation of breathing fire and the humiliation of losing control of one's bodily functions. When the day came, the air was thick with a silent dread. They entered the concrete bunker, a claustrophobic box, and put on their gas masks, the sound of their own muffled, panting breath. Filling their ears, the yellowish fog of CS gas began to fill the room, and then came the order from Reyes. "Masks off!" The impact was instant and total. It was a violation of every survival instinct. Inhaling was like swallowing embers. His eyes became orbs of liquid fire. His sinuses and throat exploded in pain. His body rebelled in a series of violent spasms, coughing, gagging. Panic was a living entity, clawing at the walls of his mind, screaming for him to run. Through a haze of pain and bodily fluids, he heard himself and the others yelling their names, a chorus of agony. And then the doors opened. They stumbled out into the blessed, clean air, a mass of weeping, vomiting, drooling men. But as the agony began to subside, it was replaced by a wave of euphoria and hysterical laughter. They had faced a chemical hell and survived. They looked at each other, a mess of snot and tears, and saw brothers. The firing range was where the abstraction of violence became a science. It was where Jacob Barnes discovered a cold, dormant skill within himself. In the first few days, the recoil of the rifle was a surprise, the noise a distraction. But under the tutelage of the instructors, quiet, patient men who moved with a deadly efficiency, he began to find his rhythm. He learned that shooting accurately was not an act of aggression but of stillness. It was about controlling the storm within himself, about finding a point of calm in the eye of the hurricane. He learned to sync his breathing with his aim, to let his body relax, to become one with the weapon. The phrase the instructor repeated was, "gentle squeeze." He learned to press the trigger with an almost imperceptible delicacy, so that the shot happened as a natural consequence of his calm, not as an act of will. When he shot his first perfect grouping, the holes in the paper target so close they overlapped, he didn't feel pride. He felt a chill. That small pattern of holes 300 meters away was the visual proof of his transformation. It was the physical manifestation of his training. He was becoming dangerously good at a skill whose sole purpose was to end a human life. The smell of hot gunpowder, the rhythmic sound of shots echoing across the range, the cold satisfaction of a perfect shot, it all became part of a new, disturbing normality. Jacob Barnes, the athlete, was being replaced by Jacob Barnes, the marksman in training. Amidst 12 weeks of calculated dehumanization, a single act of humanity reconfigured Jake's universe. The platoon was in the middle of a 30-kilometer forced march. a brutal journey under a merciless Georgia sun that had pushed most of them to their limit. A recruit from Oregon, a skinny, quiet kid named Peterson who rarely spoke, finally collapsed. He fell to his knees, his body shaking uncontrollably with heat cramps. The platoon's instinctive reaction was a shudder of fear, everyone anticipating the fury of Drill Sergeant Reyes at the interruption. Reyes marched up to Peterson, and the platoon braced for the explosion. But it didn't come. Instead, Reyes knelt in the dust beside the trembling boy, a gesture so out of character it shocked the platoon into silence. He took his own canteen, unscrewed the cap, and with a gentleness that seemed impossible from that man, poured a little water on Peterson's chapped lips. "I know it's hell, Peterson," Reyes said, his voice surprisingly low, "but hell is just a state of mind. Drink, breathe. Don't leave anyone behind." He then stood up and instead of punishing the platoon, he organized it. He ordered 2 of the strongest men to carry Peterson's gear and help him walk. "We carry him the rest of the way," he said, "because that's what we do." In that moment, Reyes's mask of a monster slipped, and Jake saw the leader behind it. A man whose job was not just to break soldiers, but also to ensure the men inside them survived. That single act of compassion didn't lessen Jake's fear of Reyes, but it complicated it with a new and profound respect. The Forge, the final week-long field training exercise, was the graduation exam from hell. It was a continuous combat simulation, designed to test every skill, break every remaining barrier, and fuse the platoon into a single cohesive weapon. They were thrown into the wilderness of Fort Benning with nothing but what they could carry. Sleep deprivation became the new norm. Jake felt like he hadn't truly slept in days, operating in a hazy waking state fueled by adrenaline. They conducted night patrols, navigating through dark forests using only a compass and the stars. They were ambushed by enemy platoons, other instructors, the sound of blank fire and smoke grenades creating a realistic chaos that tested their reflexes and their ability to work as a team under the most intense stress. Hunger was a constant, gnawing pain in his stomach. It was in this primitive, deprived state that Jake witnessed the final miracle of his transformation. On a mission to take a hill, his team's designated leader froze under simulated fire. Without an order, without hesitation, Jake took control. He yelled commands, coordinated suppressing fire, flanked the enemy position. He wasn't thinking, he was reacting, his body and mind executing years of military history that had been drilled into him in 12 weeks. They took the hill, lying in the dirt, panting, covered in mud and sweat. They were no longer individuals. They were a single creature, moving and fighting with a single purpose. They had entered the Forge as a group of scared recruits. They emerged as an infantry platoon, each man a tooth in the same gear of the war machine. Jacob Barnes no longer needed a quarterback to call the play. He was the quarterback now. Graduation day was an out-of-body experience. Standing in formation on the parade ground, his dress uniform starched and tight, Jake felt as though he were wearing a costume over another costume. He could feel the Georgia sun on his face, but a part of him was still in the cold, wet darkness of the Forge. He looked at his parents' faces in the stands. They seemed small and distant, figures from another world, another life. His mother was crying, but this time he saw pride in her tears. His father just nodded, a slow, heavy gesture of acknowledgement. A gulf of experience now separated them, a gulf that words could never cross. The ceremony was a blur of patriotic speeches from officers he'd never seen before, and drill movements executed with robotic precision. The real moment of truth came at the end, when Drill Sergeant Reyes addressed them one last time. He didn't scream. His voice was calm. "For 12 weeks, I have been your worst nightmare," he said. "I did that so when you meet your actual worst nightmare, it will just feel like another day at the office." He paused. "You arrived here as boys. Today, you leave as soldiers of the United States Army. You have earned that title. Do not dishonor it." And then he did something Jake never imagined possible. He smiled, a small, genuine smile. "I'm proud of you, soldiers. Now go and do your job." In that moment, the cycle was complete. Jacob Barnes, the kid from Ohio, was dead. In his place stood Private Barnes, a weapon forged with precision, polished by pain, and now aimed at the heart of a real war waiting for him on the other side of the world.